I knew that would jinx.
Okay, we're going to call this meeting to order.
The reduction.
Order.
That's where I'm
So,
going to land.
I understand.
Really
No,
glad
I
to talk about
understand,
it.
but
Hello?
thank you.
Sorry.
Okay. We have a lot to get through tonight, kind of brief meeting because there's a council meeting again afterwards. So the first item of business on our agenda is actually approval of minutes from our previous meetings on September 16th, September 23rd, October 14th, and October 28th. The minutes were distributed ahead of time in your packet. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move. Second.
Okay, been moved and seconded. Any corrections? If no corrections, the minutes are approved as distributed. So the next thing on our agenda is actually a community meetings debrief. So also in the packet that was distributed to you ahead of time were minutes, notes that were taken during the 5 community meetings that we held around the city in October. Hopefully you had a chance to at least review some of them, and I know that many of you were able to attend at least one of those meetings. And so in order to debrief those meetings as a group and gather our learnings, I wanted to go around the table and invite everyone who attended at least one meeting, which I think is probably all of us, I believe, to just share your thoughts for a few minutes about the process, the results, the most significant insights that you came away with. Because we'll all be sharing, probably will only be a few minutes, so think about what you think is the most important thing that you felt you gained from the process of going through the community meetings. So, Councillor Surratt, would you like to start us off?
Can I swallow first?
Yes, you may.
I was only able to attend one of the meetings at North Eugene High School, and I think, while I think it was a very worthwhile meeting, I think it pointed to the challenge of community engagement in our budget process and how you present information and how you wrestle with these choices. So I know there was maybe some dissatisfaction, not necessarily at our table, but just in general with some of the process. But for me, what I saw at that meeting, I think the real value and import of having those meetings was the opportunity for budget committee members in particular to interact with other folks in the community who don't happen to serve on the budget committee but who have an interest in what's happening with the budget, and to have that conversation and dialogue about how do we approach this, what are the trade-offs. So I wouldn't say necessarily that it helped me land on any particular approach to how we go forward, but I think the more voices and the more interaction we have, obviously within some capacity challenges, I think it really adds value for both sides, for folks sitting around this table and the folks who are watching us do this work and trying to have input into it.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Well, I would agree with those comments by and large. I thought that, a constant theme at every single meeting, I went to 3 out of the 5, was people were dissatisfied with the exercise of the, the coins representing X amount of dollars in different silos and having to reduce that by 10%. Everyone thought it was too simplistic and they didn't have enough information to, make a rational choice. Because they were just told, okay, you have to cut. But they weren't given information of like, well, maybe we could shift funds from other, maybe, they weren't given all of the options that we know are there, whether we choose to exercise them or not. And so that was, but it was kind of the first time we tried this, early engagement, and so I'm not faulting anybody for that. I mean, I think it was good to try something, and then we can realize that, wow, that wasn't really so helpful. We can do it differently next time, perhaps, or, So I'm not trying to, assign blame or anything. I don't know that I have too much more to add. What did I get out of it? I got that I had some very interesting conversations with individual people at tables and in the room. But other than that, I'm just not real sure how helpful it was for our process, frankly.
Thank you. Chelsea?
I was able to attend the Sheldon meeting, only the one. I think the feeling that I came away with is people really wanted more information. They wanted details down to how many tissues people are using, which isn't going to happen. That's not realistic, but that's really what they wanted. They were hungry for the information. I really thought that the exercise, I thought that maybe I could have done a better job framing it, because I think it does a good job sort of symbolizing what we come down to every year. It is a discussion about values ultimately, and I think that next time around maybe we can think about how to communicate that more, because yes, it wasn't exactly what we go through, but I thought it was valuable. I think people had a hard time seeing the value in it though, so more to think about there. I think people were very grateful to have the chance to actually talk to a budget committee member. It's very different than giving public testimony. I think that was a great addition. It was a good start. People really wanted to continue the discussion at my table. They really felt like we ran out of time. We couldn't go as deep as they wanted. So I think this was a great start, and we should continue to do this in some way in the future.
Great. Councilor Pryor?
I think there's probably two major themes that are actually connected that came through for me. The one that was very interesting was the notion that it is important what you do in terms of the budgeting process, but perhaps equally important, if not in some ways more important, is how you do it. A lot of the distrust, a lot of the anger, a lot of the frustration comes from the sense that our budgeting process is not transparent enough for them, is not informative enough for them, is not detailed enough for them. In some cases, it's not even something they can articulate where that frustration comes from. It's just a sense that somehow you're not doing it in a way that's satisfactory to me. And even, I think they, to some degree, can't exactly put their finger on what is it about the process that is making them uncomfortable. But it's affecting the trust level. So that when you come up with a budget, it's, I don't know if I can trust this budget or not because I don't know how you got there. Which then goes to the second connected point, which beginning to hear is, what is the level of detail that begins to create comfort? And I think it gets back to something that we've talked a little bit about before, that the city managers mentioned, is I think some people believe that if you can just get enough detail, enough pieces, somehow the answer to our budget problem will be there. And so when you give them the exercise that we gave them, or you gave them the documentation we gave them, they said, there's not enough here for me to come up with that solution. Give me more detail, and somehow that solution will show up. Instead of being able to say, the pieces are all here, we just have to figure out how to put them together. It's no, the pieces aren't all here. If the pieces were all here, we'd have a solution. So we're still missing pieces. And I think that's part of the frustration, is they don't feel they're being given enough budget to find those pieces that they think are going to solve the problem. So the two are connected. It's somehow a process that is frustrating to them because they're not finding that solution.
Thank you. Bob?
I was able to attend all 5, facilitated 2 of them. I view the effort as a great first step to reaching out to the community, to sit with them, to have discourse and discussions with them. I would have loved to have seen the same size crowd at the last one that we saw at the first one, but as meetings go and you get further away from that first one, attendance started to wane. What Councilor Pryor was saying, there's a level of frustration out there in the community. They do want more knowledge. They're not quite sure if they can handle all of it, but they'd sure like that opportunity to at least review it. There was, I think, initially a lot of distrust, and trust was built through the evening as we spent time with people. Kind of the 2 reoccurring themes that I always kept hearing was find a way to make it happen, find a way to continue the services and to fund everything, find that magic pill that we're all going to be thinner tomorrow with. And they all wanted to have more discussion about what other types of revenue might we be looking at and how might that impact them. So there was a lot of different variations on those themes, but those seem to be the 2 things that people were most centered on. Of course, we had those people who were advocating their program, expected that. They're very adamant that they want to keep the programs that are near and dear to their heart. But they want us to find a way, and they're hoping that we can look within the numbers and solve that riddle.
Thank you. Ken?
I attended 3 of the meetings. I found them very helpful. I agree with most everything that's been said. I think the interaction was really important. Us getting out there and doing it was really important. We heard a lot of diverse opinions. In kind of thinking about it today, I really had kind of 3 or 4 camps, if you will, across all of the meetings. I had some people who didn't trust any of this and felt, gosh, the money's there, you really don't even need to be doing this. I had some people who were very clear that I don't think there was any issue of trust at all. It was more like if your revenues aren't there to support the programs, you need to make some reductions, and you should do it in a thoughtful way. But we do that in our homes, and we do it in our businesses, and you should do it. Of course, there were people who came who were single issue, and they were very clear. A couple of them were very clear about that. I had one person at the last meeting who talked to me at some length about, gosh, and I don't think, again, there was any issue of trust or anything. It was just, you really don't need to be doing this. You guys can find a way to support these programs and be working at the same time with all due diligence to get something in terms of revenue out there in front of the community. And I was pretty passionate about that. I guess it was good to do them. And I think what I came away with was a feeling that as we go through this over the next number of months, and I know it means more work, or it means more work for the staff, and I'm not sure how it all unfolds, but I think it's really important to try to keep doing that. I mean, to the extent we can do that when we talk about revenue sources, I think just the more that we can communicate this information, I think it will help all of those different groups. We're not going to satisfy everybody, and the hard decisions all remain there, but I think the more we can keep putting it out there and talking about it, will be good.
Thank you. Councilor Zelenka?
Yeah, I thought it was a good effort. I attended the first one at South Willamette. I'm not sure that we got a lot of useful feedback. I think we got a lot of feedback that we can actually use in the process. I thought the video was great. I thought the video was one of the things we should have done a long time ago. I think we have not done a good job of getting our message out about what we've already done in terms of the reduction of 100 FTEs and over $20 million worth of changes in the budget, and kind of all those things doing differently and all that stuff. And everybody, when we talk about that, they kind of almost ignored the fact that we had already done all that stuff, and that was the first thing they said we should do. And of course, that is the first thing that we did. But people don't really recognize that and don't know it. I think there was a bit of frustration and trust issues on quite a few people's minds at the time. Why we didn't make the cuts, and all of a sudden the money just appeared, and here we are, and we didn't make any cuts and didn't have to do any hard choices. And after, explaining that we just used reserves and kind of kicked the can down the road, people, at least in my group and a little broader at that, I thought was very clear that they didn't want us to kick the can down the road again. They wanted us to solve this problem. I thought that came across really clear. I thought that people thought there should be more transparency, better information, and that's the really tough part about this whole process, is that our budget is $380 million. It's very detailed. It's very complex. There's 44 services and all these different kinds of funds, so it's very detailed and very complex, and there's no easy way to understand it, and people were looking for an easy way to fix it, and there's just not an easy way to fix it. And so when you just try to explain it's just the general fund, they want to go off and talk about airports and things like that. So it didn't. it's a very tough thing to do, to ask for meaningful feedback and at the same time educate people. And I thought we did a pretty good job of the educating. I'm not sure we did a really good job about getting useful feedback for our conversation we're going to have over the next month or two.
Thank you. Councilor Poling.
I made 2 of the meetings. I was a little disappointed in the turnout. I appreciate and I want to thank all the citizens that did come to the meetings, but I just felt with all the advance notice that we were putting out that we would have maybe drawn a little more attendance than we did. But having said that, I think the people that were there did participate at a good level. Things that I heard was, first of all, the video that John did was an eye-opener to a lot of people. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more Budget 101 into that, a little bit clearer. The exercise, like George says, I don't know how worthwhile it was. I heard some people say they wanted more details. They wanted to see a line item, a simplified line item budget to make the decisions on where to move the coins. Some of the people said, well, I moved the coins from public safety because they had the most and we had to make the cuts. But I don't want to move the coins, but we were told to move coins, so that's what we did. An interesting comment, one person actually, I think it was at the last meeting, said that after making all the reductions in that exercise, they actually added more to economic development, because with economic development you bring jobs, and if you bring jobs you bring more money in, and the rest of it takes care of itself. So, there are people that are out there that understand the budget process. It's just how we get there is the big question. And, I don't know about the trust level. I didn't actually hear that at the tables that I was sitting at and monitoring it. But I know, we did a lot of outreach, and for the first time out, I think we did a pretty good job. There's just some fine-tuning if we do this again next year that we need to do.
Thank you. Jill?
Yes, I attended the South Eugene program, and as far as meaningful comments, our table, although I thought it was a good exercise. I thought it would be a good way just to kind of start the process and discuss how difficult it is, but the majority of the people at my table didn't want to do it, so I had to completely reshape all my questions, okay? So I guess what I would say is I think people had really interesting ideas. People expressed they used these words like, transparency, that comes up over and over, and so I'd ask, like, what does that mean to you, that word, right? Because everybody uses it, but what does that mean? And a couple people said it means that we know what's going on. And then I said, so how many people at the table have looked at the website? Are you aware that the budget's on the website? Well, and several people expressed that they don't have a lot of time to do that. And I think it goes back to Councilor Pryor's point that people want to know, but they don't really know what they want to know, but they know they don't know it. It's something like that, right? And so it was very interesting. I thought the video was great. I actually agree with Councilor Poling that I think it could have been even longer. It was great, but I actually think a little Budget 101, how this all happens, because what happened, people said, I got a couple comments at the table that said, well, I said, do you think the city's doing a good job? Do you think everybody's trying to be fiscally responsible with your money? Again, I was having to go, on a tangent on my table. And almost everybody said yes, and several people said, well, after seeing that video, it sounds like you're doing a great job. And then there was additional comments to that. So in any case, and that was a good process. My only comment, and it was very helpful to me as a new budget committee member, as Councilor Surratt said, it's very helpful to hear what people say, and it's amazingly interesting. And I guess my only comment would be, perhaps, I would just like a series of questions. Like, instead of trying to guide, in a big picture way, guide conversation, because at some point it becomes like herding cats, because if people don't want to play your game, they won't. And then it kind of, you spend a bunch of time facilitating why the game is good, and then deciding the game isn't going to be played, and then we have to go another attack. So that took some time. But questions, like flat-out questions, like, do you feel the city is being fiscally responsible with your money? And if not, why not? okay, and then go around the questions. But I commend the process. I like what whoever put that together did a really nice job, and I agree with Bob. It was a really great first effort, and I'm sure that the more we do it, the better we'll get at it. So that was my... Bill.
Good evening. I was struck by the fact that there's no one item that's not going to impact some constituent. That every potential reduction we have will impact some members of our community, even if it's not a service that I personally or any of my friends would use. That doesn't mean that somebody isn't using it, and I had a chance to speak with several people that use services that I've never used and passionately spoke about, how much those services have impacted their lives. And that was useful to get kind of a human touch to what otherwise looks like a bunch of, line items. So I found that part to be the most valuable to me.
I found that people wanted to talk about cuts, new revenue, and gap funding for new revenue until new revenue came in a broader perspective. It was very difficult for them just to talk about cuts and to prioritize them. They wanted to have some idea of what was possible.
I would reiterate a lot of what we've heard already, but I'll just focus on a couple things. One is the public trust transparency piece. Somebody talked about the information. I think the information is out there, and I heard that from folks that they don't have the time to digest it all, so it's that balance of how much do you give them, how much do they have the opportunity to absorb. But one of the key messages I took away from it is there was agreement at the table I was at was that we should make the tough choices that need to be made and don't put them off, and then kind of figure it out from there. There was some talk about revenue, but through the conversation, understanding that with this budget cycle, there didn't seem to be opportunity to explore that fully. So in lieu of that, at this point, again, making the tough choices to figure out, I think Ken said, make the tough decisions thoughtfully, but more like don't kick the can down the road again and live within our means. So, and then the other piece that stood out to me was the special interest that showed up. Specifically in my table, I heard a fair amount from the pool contingency and the library contingency, and some of what I heard was make cuts, but don't cut what I care about. So
yes, exactly.
It's a tough dynamic.
Welcome to the Budget Committee.
Is that it?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Councilor Clark? You still there?
Yes, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I'm having a little difficulty hearing, but I hope I come through clearly on that side. The meeting that I attended, I was struck by the uniformity of many of the comments. The most interesting part of that for me being that it was frustrating because what was said most frequently by most people elicited from staff and from other elected folks and people involved in the process who were there, the answer, we can't do that. And for me, that was frustrating to participate in because I understood what they were saying. For example, one of the most frequently mentioned things was that near 60% employee costs are ridiculous and unsustainable. And that's the sort of thing we should be addressing as it pertains to a majority of the budget. And of course, the answer predominantly in those cases is, well, that's not within the purview of the Budget Committee or Council to negotiate that. And I found having to give that answer very, very frustrating. Another kind of area of uniform comments was around things that most people believe the city should not be doing or assets that we should not own. I felt it was fairly commonly held around the table that Civic Stadium was something that the people in that area of town were not crazy about us getting involved in, as well as it was mentioned many times that we shouldn't own Laurelwood Golf Course. I did have a couple of interesting suggestions, however. One young lady, I think I recall it was a teacher at my table, suggested that we should absolutely increase sin taxes to the degree that we can and have local taxes on alcohol and tobacco, as well as another idea that I thought was interesting was that we should absolutely be licensing bicycles and collecting revenue from that, as that's a major part of new road construction work that we're doing, and certainly a way to recover revenues from the university students who use services of the city. So I thought I'd add that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Councilor Evans, are you on the phone? No, didn't have him. Okay, guess not. Well, I went to two of the meetings, the one at South Eugene High School and then later up at North Eugene. I found it really valuable. I think the exercise was good in that it got people to think about trade-offs and grapple with a little bit how hard and frustrating this is. I thought it worked better the second go-around that I went to at North, where we had the coin exercise as well as the matrix with the actual proposed cuts and how the decisions had, how we got into the place of looking at those particular things. It gave people some more to talk about. So I thought it was a good exercise, got better, and probably could even get better as we go forward. The people at my two tables, first of all, I think it was just a really valuable thing to do. People appreciated us being out there, appreciated the chance to be heard, the chance to get involved if they wanted to. I think it was a good trust-building exercise for some people, and I think that was one of our goals, and also a good educational opportunity. At one of my tables, when I started the conversation, the person was sure that we were doing a terrible job, and it was just disastrous, and clearly there was all this money that we had, and we're just not doing it right. And I think by the end, when I asked the question, how are you going to know if we're doing a good job? Because that was one of the questions that we asked people. He said, well, it's just really helpful to meet you guys and know that you're giving it a good faith effort and that there's thought behind these things. And so, I feel a lot better. And so I think there was a lot of learning and growth. I also heard a lot from people. I learned a lot about where the holes are, I think, in the messaging that's been done so far, and heard a lot from people about things that people really want to help solve the problem, which is terrific. And it was a good opportunity to talk about implications of some things. A lot of desire to use volunteers in certain ways where we currently use staff, and a good opportunity to talk about where are there places where that does work and makes sense, and where are there places where that's more challenging and there are significant implications. And I think it gave people the chance to kind of grapple with some of those things. So overall, I thought it was great. I would like us to consider how we might do that as we move into the next phase in the spring as well. I thought it was really valuable. So, Mayor Piercy.
So I would really find it helpful, now that you've gone through this exercise, to know whether you think we would get more participation by going out to all the high schools and going all over, or do you think that we would get the same amount of participation if we had a central source that invited people to come from all over to do the same thing? Or I just curious about what people
Well, I'll share one piece of feedback that I had, and then I'd like it if other people have thoughts too. So in particular, when I was at North Eugene, people really spoke to how much they appreciated it being there. So that at least was definitely feedback in that session that I got about how people really appreciated we came to them. And I think in certain parts of town, people may feel like they're always having to travel somewhere else. So that was what I heard there. So, Councilor Poling?
Yeah. I think it is good to go to the different areas of town because, like Laura said, each area has its own little differences. However, at the meeting at Sheldon, I noticed that in talking with the people that there were a number of people at that meeting that actually lived in South Eugene that missed the first meeting, so they thought they'd catch the second meeting. So in a way, it's good to have it in different parts of town, but the meeting isn't necessarily just narrowed down to people in that part of the community. You have people from other parts of the community attending, and by doing the number of meetings that we did, I think it allowed the people that did attend to work their schedule so they could go to at least one of them.
Councilor Pryor?
Yeah, I would really reinforce the notion that these kinds of meetings need to become an ongoing part of the budget process. When I talked earlier about how you do it is just as important as what you do, this is an important part of how you do it. If they feel that our budget process is conducted in some sort of series of meetings away from public visibility, even though it's really not, they still perceive it that way. So going to where they are and figuring that out, not doing it in a way that becomes staff-intensive and sucks up a lot of additional resources, but there are structures in place that we probably could take advantage of in terms of doing some sort of outreach. But I would really encourage us to build this kind of outreach into our ongoing budget process so that people can feel more of a participant in it rather than just, in some cases, a victim of, but really more just an observer.
Great, thank you. Councilor Surratt.
Yeah, I want to echo that sentiment. I absolutely agree. I think it's worth the effort. I think as we build it into, if we are successful in building it into the process, we'll get greater participation and we'll get better at doing it. And I also think when it comes to looking for new revenue options, having that built that relationship will benefit us even more so than the way we've handled things in the past. So I would really like to see it made part of how we think about the budgeting process and the cycle and community input.
Thank you. Bob.
As I said, this was a great first step. It needs to be a series of meetings. I believe a few of them had poor attendance just because of unfortunate timing with the World Series game or whatever. Mm-hmm. We did have people missing one and coming to another. We had one gentleman who made all five. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're here, Joe. It's important for us to go where they are. It's hard to get people to stop their normal everyday routine and go, oh, yes, I'm going to go to a committee meeting tonight on the budget. I mean, it's just hard to get them to do that. Life will take over. They may have the best intentions at 8 a.m. and who knows what happened during that day and they've forgotten about it at 6 p.m. So the more diversified we can make these meetings in locations throughout the city at maybe different times. Maybe it's not always a weeknight. Maybe we do it on a weekend. If we can go where they are instead of expecting them to come to us, even if we're in their neighborhood, it will continue to get more opinions and a greater diversity of opinions.
Great. Thank you. Any final thoughts?
So just a couple things is that I think, and I think we're trying to do this, but I think we have to do it in a really public way, is that, yes, we're going to do meetings that are around the community, but here's the 5 other ways that you can participate and make sure that they know there's an array of ways for people to participate that suits them, right? Because people have different modes of participation. The other thing is the thing that I think you saw in the FIT committee, and I think you saw it with the public, and that is it's really important that they come to those meetings with a pretty clear idea of what they're supposed to do, that it's not something they have to figure out once they get there, that they understand that you're not asking them to make decisions, you're asking them to come to get their questions answered or to give their thoughts to however you want to put it. But I just think the clarity, because even with the FIT committee, once we sort of understood it, you had to make clear to them that they weren't there to figure out revenue options. It took a while for them to really understand what they needed to do, and once they did, then they could do it, and they did it really, really well. So I think in terms of whatever form of outreach we use, being so clear about what it is we want from them, and then do it. Then they'll feel comfortable because they'll understand what you're asking, and they'll be able to respond to that in an effective way with some better level of ease, I think.
Thank you. Well, once again, thanks to everyone who participated, all the committee members. It's really terrific that everyone was able to make at least one of the meetings and see this process in action. And certainly a huge thank you to all the community members who took the time to come to a meeting in their free time and to share with us their thoughts about how we can strengthen the city, and how we can build a budget that reflects the priorities of this community. So huge thank you, and of course thanks to the staff too. There was a lot of work that went into putting those meetings together and learning as we went along and changing it and getting it better week to week. So thank you to all who helped make that happen. So as we've gone through this process, we have, at our retreat, we talked about a number of policies that we wanted to get more information on as background as before we went into our deliberations about FY14. And we have our final policy-related presentation tonight, and that is about our general fund reserve policies. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue Kutza-George and to give us a presentation about the general fund reserve policies.
Okay. So I'm going to give you a general overview about reserves and how reserves relate to fund balance in our CAFR. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the city should maintain reserves, how much is prudent, and I'll also compare Eugene to other jurisdictions and give you some flavor about what the rating agencies say about maintaining reserves. So, what are reserves and fund balance? So, reserves are a concept in the budget. Reserves are your policy intention to commit funds for particular purposes in the future. They're forward-looking, they're estimates, and they may rely on certain things to happen in order for those reserves to be fully realized. Fund balance is an accounting term. It represents the amount of money left over at the end of the year. It's historic in nature, and we can tell you down to the dollar how much it was, because it's in the past. These two things are related. The largest factor that determines how much fund balance you have is the amount of reserves that you've budgeted. Reserves are essentially saying we are going to budget to not spend a certain amount of dollars. So the expectation is that those dollars will be available at the end of the year and will be your part of your fund balance. So here's a comparison just so you can see how those things relate. The orangish bar is the budget side of things. That is our unappropriated ending fund balance and reserves together. So that's basically what we've budgeted to not spend during the year. And then the gray bar is our gap fund balance that you would see in our CAFR. So you can see I've shown 5 years of history here. We don't yet have our final ending fund balance for FY13, but we will have that soon. And we're in the middle of FY14. So we've got a budget for what will happen in FY14, but we don't yet know what will happen. You can see from this chart, however, that we do expect that because our budgeted reserves are going down, that our fund balance will probably also go down by the time we get to the end of FY14. So why should we have reserves? There are really three main reasons why we would have reserves. It's considered a prudent financial management practice to do so. The first reason why we would have a reserve is to cover our cyclical cash flow needs. And what that means is that our general fund, 2/3 of the revenues in our general fund come from property taxes. And you know yourselves that your property taxes are due this week. Well, our fiscal year started in July, and we have to pay vendors and pay employees starting in July. So the UEFB is what allows us to be able to do that without borrowing money. The second reason to have reserves is really to maintain some financial flexibility. We don't always know what's going to happen. Having reserves allows us to be able to respond when something happens, to manage uncertainty, and in some cases, like we're doing this year, to bridge a gap. And the final reason to have reserves is basically to set aside money for a particular purpose. Maybe we want to save up for something, or maybe we know we're going to need something next year. So we use other reserves for that purpose. And I've given some examples here of what those other reserves would be. So just a little bit more about unappropriated ending fund balance, or UEFB. You can see from this chart, basically, this compares how much we've budgeted in terms of UEFB and reserve for revenue shortfall, and then our minimum month-end cash balance as of the end of October. Without the UEFB, we would have been in a negative cash position. And in fact, we do draw down even more cash in November, but by the very end of November, we've gotten in our property tax receipts, so that month-end cash goes back up. But there are several weeks in November where we're continuing to draw down at a rate of $2 to $2.5 million a week. So,
Can I just ask a quick question on that?
Yes, sir.
Just for clarification. So what that says is the gray bar is kind of what we have in an account.
That's the reserve for revenue shortfall.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
and that we're paying bills with that,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't provide enough money to meet the cycle, and so we're having to use some of the UEFB in order to make some of those actual checks that we're issuing.
Right. So if you think about the UEFB and the reserve as being an amount we've got in our budget that we're not going to spend, then you would think that our minimum cash balance would be higher than that, right? If you're not going to spend it, then you should still have it. But this is showing that we are spending it during the year. We end up the year with a higher cash balance because by then the property tax receipts have come in and so forth. So, yes, that's a good clarification. Reserve for revenue shortfall. This is a reserve that we use to weather those tough economic times and provide us with some financial flexibility. It's really the thing that we use to balance the general fund. So if we have a surplus, we put money in here. If we have a deficit, we draw this reserve down. This shows the reserve for revenue shortfall at the point at which we adopted the budget each year. You can see we drew it down pretty close to zero in FY09 and FY10 at the start of the recession, but we've built that back up. We've got an 8% target for that reserve, and you can see for FY14 we drew that reserve down again so that we could actually embark on this conversation to talk about what can we do to find a stable or sustainable budget. This reserve has allowed us to be able to have that conversation. Other reserves, they can kind of come and go depending on what the need is. We do have a reserve for encumbrance every year. And that represents when we enter into a contract one year and the contract doesn't complete by June 30th because our work is ongoing. It doesn't just all stop at June 30th. So for those contracts that are ongoing and cross over to the next fiscal year, we take that unspent part of the contract and we carry it into the next year. So that's a reserve for encumbrance. That goes away in December when you approve Supplemental Budget 1. We've also used reserves to save up for a specific purpose. The Olympic trials in 2012 was one of those examples. And we're currently using a reserve for property tax appeals to buffer the impacts from several large appeals that are ongoing at the moment. So this is always the key question, right? How much should we have in reserves? And the answer is, well, it depends. There's really not a single answer to that. This is a quote from the rating agency saying there's no one-size-fits-all formula for that. There are a number of factors that we should take into account when we're determining how much is the right size for us in Eugene. The history and trend of our own reserves, so how are we doing compared to ourselves? How are we doing compared to other entities? And what might we actually, at some point, have to use those reserves for? And would it be adequate for those things? So I'm going to go through each one of those quickly. So here is the history of our fund balance over the last 5 years. I've shown it as a percent of revenues and as a percent of expenditures. The percentages are slightly different. The reason I do that is because when we start talking about the rating agencies, they look at fund balance as a percent of revenues, but our policies are fund balance as a percent of expenditures. So just because there's different ways to look at it, I've shown you both here. They're a little bit different, but not substantially different.
So that's, just so I'm clear, that's a percent of revenues for that year. This is not per 2013 revenue.
No, each year.
For each year, okay.
Correct. The average over the 5 years was about 32%.
What would that look like before '08 when the recession started?
It was, it kind of went up and down, but it was, I do have a longer history. It has been in that 20 to 30-ish% range. And in fact, one of the things that I noticed when I went back to do this analysis, I mean, this is the same analysis I did when I talked to you in 2008 on this topic, and I noticed that the conclusions really aren't a whole lot different, that the situation is fairly similar in terms of a policy conversation about what are our trends and what's an appropriate place for us to target for our fund balance or reserve levels. So next, folks often want to know, how do we compare? The best source really for those kind of comparative statistics is to look to the rating agencies. Moody's Investor Service is the rating agency that rates our bonds, and they rate approximately 8,200 local governments, 3,000 cities, and they compile statistics for those jurisdictions that produce a CAFR on generally accepted accounting principles. They produce median levels for various kinds of statistics. This is really helpful because it is important to try and do those comparisons on the same basis, and it's not always easy to tease that out, but the rating agencies do have the resources to be able to do that. They do a comparison of fund balance for the general fund, reporting fund. You may recall we have three pieces to our general fund. The main sub-fund is the one that we really focus on here, but our general fund also includes the cultural services sub-fund and the equipment replacement sub-fund. So they do it on the reporting fund basis. They do it for generally accepted accounting principles basis, not our budget basis. And then they look at the trends over time. They say it's important to look at multiple periods over time, that focusing on any one year doesn't really give you a good picture of what's going on with any particular jurisdiction. So this was in your memo in a table, and I just thought I'd do it in a picture so that you can see that a little bit better. Eugene's past 5 years of general fund balance as a percent of revenues is that set of columns on the right. And you can see, if you look at this carefully, that in 2008 and 2009, Eugene actually was lower in terms of the median fund balance as a percent of revenues than other cities in the U.S. And in 2009, 2010, 11, and 12 were a little bit higher. The trend for all U.S. cities has been upwards for the past 3 years. Our trend is starting to go downwards. So that's a comparison on a really big picture basis with, many, many cities in the U.S.
Was there anything significant about the AA1 rating versus AA rating?
So there are AAA, AA, A ratings. We are AA rating, but within the AA category, there are 3 levels. AA1 is the highest, so we are the highest, AA2 and AA3. And for the, if you look at all U.S. cities, the median rating is a AA3. So we really have a high rating compared to sort of the median city in the country. This is a comparison of Eugene versus the larger cities in Oregon. The circled bunch of bars is Eugene. The far right bunch of bars is a combination of all of the cities in Oregon that Moody's rates. And then I've shown individually the larger cities that Moody's rates. And you can see it's kind of all over the place. But Eugene is really kind of in that same ballpark in terms of the average for Oregon cities over the past few years. So what's recommended for our general fund reserve policies? What we have been working on for the past few years is a target of about 25% of expenditures. That consists of two pieces, our UEFB, which is a council policy to keep our unappropriated ending fund balance at 2 months' worth of expenditures. That policy was adopted in 1997, and the UEFB has been budgeted at that level pretty much since the late 90s. Reserve for revenue shortfall, that target of 8% was set right when John showed up. We had gone through a number of conversations with the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee didn't feel at that point that they wanted to formally adopt a policy because we were in between city managers. John got here, we talked about it, and he helped to settle on this target of 8% of expenditures. So the combination of about 25% of expenditures for our reserves is recommended really to be consistent with what we've done, our own history and trends in fund balance, to be consistent with what other jurisdictions do, and really to be sufficient to meet those potential needs that we might have. And the last piece I wanted to talk about is, like, why do we care what the rating agencies think? Some people ask that. And I would say a couple of things. The rating agencies really provide a neutral third-party evaluation of really how are we doing. It's a report card that's consistent across the country in terms of one quote that I read today was, how close are you to distress, right? So a high rating means you're farther away from distress. That's fiscal distress. That's probably a good thing to strive for. So having that neutral third party take a look at how we're doing, I think is valuable. It's a source of pride. We are a highly rated city. We've been a highly rated city for 60 plus years. And that high rating puts us in some really good company. And so I think for folks like a finance director, maintaining that rating is really a measure of like how well we are doing. And really from the practical level, when we're talking about the community members, if our bonds get downgraded, it costs more money. It costs people more money if they decide that they want to approve money to pay for street repairs or to purchase parks or to build a fire station. It will cost more money. And so there really is a practical dollar impact from having a bond rating downgrade. Just a little bit more about what Moody's does when they look at our credit. They really take into account a lot of different factors. Listed some of the weighted average approach that they take here. Financial strength is about 30% of their evaluation. They rely heavily on historic information over multiple periods of years. They rely on peer comparisons, and they focus a great deal on financial flexibility, and they look for a city to be able to handle whatever might come its way, whether it's something that you could predict or something that's not predictable. They also, have what appears to be a formula here, but they do, one of the quotes from Moody's was that the rating is really a complex web of issues that affect a local government and their relative creditworthiness. And so there are other things that they might take into account that aren't necessarily represented in a formula that would affect the rating. And the quote here, there's no algebraic formula by which a rating can be predicted. So while they do a lot of analysis, at the end of the day, it may not be strictly a quantitative look at a jurisdiction's situation. And our last report from Moody's was about 2 years ago. It's a little hard to read, but I've put it up here to just show you all those red circles are really saying that our financial management, our financial performance, our reserve levels, and our financial position relative to peers is very significant in their review of our credit. So when I think about our reserves, I believe that the community's been well served by Eugene having those reserves available. These reserves have allowed us to keep services intact during tough times while we're able to have conversations about how we should proceed. Not all cities can do that. Some places, when revenues don't come in as expected or expenditures spike up, those jurisdictions have to immediately start cutting programs. And our reserves have allowed us to have a little bit more time to be thoughtful in how we approach those financial situations. A minimum fund balance target of 25% seems reasonable when you look at our history, when you look at peer jurisdictions. And really, maintaining our reserves is key to maintaining our high bond rating, which has direct implications for the costs of some of the projects that we want to undertake. That was it.
Great. Thank you very much. So we'll now open the queue. So Councilor Polling, I believe you were first in the queue.
Thank you. Yeah, Sue, I just have one question on slides. Let's see, slide 15. This says a downgrade will cost taxpayers more money for bond projects. Does that mean that if our bond rating changes this year or next year, that our current bond projects, such as the general obligation bond for street repairs, does that change, or is it just for future bond projects?
Well, that's an interesting question. For bonds that we've issued, that we've made a commitment to pay over a long period of time, like fire station bonds, no, it wouldn't change the interest rate on those bonds. The street bonds, you may recall, we are funding on a kind of a short-term bond basis, and so yes, it would impact those street bonds right away.
Okay, that was a 5-year, 2 5-year bonds.
Right, but we're doing that in a form of a line of credit type borrowing. So.
Are there any other ones that we have out there that might be affected if our bond rating changes?
We also have some parks bonds that we are doing also on a line of credit type basis. So those would also be affected.
Thank you.
So I put myself in the queue next. I just had a question. I want to make sure I'm interpreting some of these graphs correctly. Mm-hmm. So it looked like our total target is 24.7% of expenditures. Mm-hmm. And slide 10 looks like at least FY 11 and 12, we're closer up to 30%. Is that right? So do you know what we were for FY 13?
No, we don't have final.
We don't have. Okay.
And the other thing I would say is that our reserves are sort of the minimum level that we would be expecting to end the year with. Mm-hmm. Fund balance includes other things. So fund balance will include revenues and expenditures that came in differently than we budgeted. They'll include things that aren't in the budget, like inventories or prepaid deposits for things and so forth. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. And I tried to get at that with this slide to say, yes, our reserves have been less than what our fund balance is. And there are a number of reasons for that.
So what's the best way? I mean, when as an average citizen looking at this graph, for example, mm-hmm. I go, okay, so we budgeted ourselves to have these number of dollars. Look, woohoo, we have more dollars. Great, we're going to plow that back into other things we need to spend money on. What's the best way to understand this and explain to the public why that may not be the case?
Right, so
for non-accounting-ish people.
Right. So again, the fund balance includes more than just what you set aside as reserves. We did in the FIT. Those of you that attended the FIT may recall we had a little bit of we have a chart that we set out that shows you some of those different things that are included in fund balance. Some of those things are encumbrance. So we talked a little bit about contracts, right? So your fund balance will include encumbrance, contracts that you didn't quite finish, but that you're carrying over to the next year. Your fund balance will include, by the time the fund balance is determined, the budget committee, in FY12 at least, had already determined to spend part of that fund balance to balance the FY13 budget. So there was already a commitment to spend part of it. Then there's the part of the fund balance that represents the difference between what we estimated and what actually happened. And that's what we call our marginal beginning working capital. So I am giving you the accounting definition, but maybe we can get there. And so that is basically, if somebody's looking at our financial report, they'll see that's an amount that's listed as unassigned. But that is the amount of money that basically the City Council considers on Supplemental Budget 1 in December. So by the time the fund balance has been determined and the CAFR has been published, the City Council has already basically used that money, determined how to use that money for something else.
Okay.
So remember, the fund balance is a historic point in time, and so things happen after the fund balance is determined that then affect how much actual money is available to do something with. And so reserves are the way that we attempt to take that into account.
So would you say that if you wanted to explain to folks the amount of money that's really available to do something with, the reserve money, the reserve amount tends to be a better indicator of that. And while it's just kind of an estimate going forward, the fund balance includes all these things that are already committed that you really can't do anything unless you want to break contracts or things like that, which you're not going to do. And so so I think if people just kind of focus on the reserve portion of that, they would say, okay, here's how much is available to do something with, and you have the cash here, and then it's a matter of how do we choose to use that, part of which, as Sue mentioned, we use a whole bunch of that to pay our bills, or to have money to pay our bills before we get property tax receipts. Because we could borrow that money,
So it's
too.
more of a cash flow management tool
Yeah,
in some ways.
because we could borrow that money, but then now you're having to pay interest on borrowed money, and so now you're just ultimately costing a little bit more for a little bit of use. And so it feels like if you focus on the reserve side, the fund balance is important, and the Budget Committee and the Council deals with that, but I would think for a general explanation, unless somebody really wants to get on the detail, the reserve tells you how much money is probably really available to do something with that's not already committed.
Thank you. Councilor Brown.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. I just have a couple questions. I'm looking at slide number 13, and excellent. And I see, the general fund balance as a percentage of revenues. I look at Eugene and I see that we're, around 35% the last couple of years, 35 pushing 40. And we're AA1 rated. Then I look over at Salem. We're almost exactly the same size of the city. I don't know anything about Salem's budget. I haven't looked at it. I would assume that there could be some similarities there. And I see that their general fund balance as a percentage of revenues is hovering a little bit over 20%, but it was significantly under. And they are also have a AA1 rating from Moody's. And so I'm wondering if it would hurt us to have a smaller general fund balance as a percentage of revenue.
So I can't
I'm
what's
just
going on with sales.
and maybe at this point this is just a theoretical question, but I look at that and I see same size city, same bond rating, and I go, that's something that maybe we could look at. But I'm not. Anyway, you can't help me out here just yet. Okay. That's okay. Now my second question is on page 8, and I'm looking. It was number 16 on the.
Number 6.
presentation. And I'm looking under Moody's approach, and I see under the first bullet point, economic factors, 40%. What exactly does that mean? I mean, does that mean local economic factors or national economic factors? Or
Local, so they're looking at...
what are the metrics for that? What do they look at there? Unemployment rate, or, you know?
They look at, list here, they look at the size of the economy, how well it's been growing, what the tax base is like, how much concentration there is in the tax base for, individual employers. They look at, really what they're looking at is capacity to generate the resources needed to pay for the service system, and vulnerability. So they're looking at factors that would describe, how vulnerable the economy is to shocks or changes.
Sure.
They look at wealth, comparative wealth statistics. They look at demographics, per capita income.
And you have, was this part of the information that we got in a packet? Oh, okay.
No, this is their...
Where could we access that? I'm just curious. I'd just like to pursue this a little.
I can send it to you. It's their rating methodology. So,
okay.
It's a little bit out of date because they're in the process of changing it, but I can send it to you.
Good, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Great. Councilor Surratt, thanks. Councilor Surratt.
So I just want to make sure I was putting these pieces together correctly. On the summary slide, it says a minimum fund balance target of 25% of expenditures is reasonable. On slide 14, you have what's recommended for general fund reserve policies, 16.7% for the UEFB and 8% reserve for revenue shortfall, equaling 24.7%. So that's relating back to the recommendation on the last page. Okay, just making sure those are getting put together. And then as going back to slide 10, where it shows the revenues and expenditures side by side. So for FY11 and FY12, we actually ended up almost 10 percentage points above that recommended target. Am I reading that correctly?
So again, we have reserves. And
looking at the expenditure.
And we have fund balance. So if you remember back here, we can't budget to maintain a particular level of fund balance because there are factors that go into that we can't predict in the budget or that even aren't included in the budget. And so when you set a reserve target, you're setting a minimum fund balance level. It's likely there will be factors, as has occurred here, that will make that fund balance a little bit higher, but they're for things that you don't necessarily, is what John was talking about, they're not necessarily funds that you could then use for those reserves, right?
No, I'm sorry. I'm just trying, so Moody's likes to look at it as percentage of revenues, but we're being given the policy recommendation as percentage of expenditures.
Correct.
So I would love to see where we've hit on that percentage target.
So this shows you both. They're a little bit different, but they're not greatly different.
Right, so that's what I was saying. So we ended up at about 35% in FY11 and a little bit less than that in FY12, which is 10% higher than the recommended 24%. Am I misinterpreting this?
Well, again, reserves is a budget concept. Fund balance is the end of the year. We can calculate it down to the dollar how much it is. So reserves are your policy intention to keep a certain level. You look like you were writing something. No, do you want to?
No, I think the answer is yes, but then it goes into why.
Why? Yeah.
Right. So that extra 10% is all these other kinds of things. I don't know, there could be grant revenue in there or something like that that doesn't, that bumps it up, and so it's not necessarily available, but it shows up there.
Okay, right. So the contracts. So when John was talking, John said it much more elegantly than I did, but there are the contract dollars that we carry over from one year to the next. That's included in the fund balance, but it's not something that we use for our reserve, right? So,
No, I get the distinction. I just wanted to make the connection between the recommendation and where we actually ended up and how that rolls out. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Pryor.
Thanks. This is really helpful. In trying to talk about the reserves from the standpoint of, is there within this any flexibility that doesn't provoke a Jenga effect, I think is important. And is there a way to do that? Moody's is one example. Cash flow is another example of Jenga effects that affect at least part of the reserves. But the question then becomes, if you look at slide 6, where the cash flow line is, or the cash balance line is, there is actually some freeboard apparent, but is it really apparent, or is it just a function of how graphs work is part of it? Because somebody could look at it and say, in order to maintain minimum cash balance with your reserve for revenue shortfall and your UEFB, there's some freeboard there. But what we're really saying is, no, there's not, because it's still revenue yet to come in, or there's some other kind of an effect there.
So this is the cash balance as of the end of October, and we don't have a financial system that can easily report the cash balance every single day of the year. So we really report at the end of the month.
Right.
So this looks at the end of October, which is our lowest end of month. But in November, we are spending another $2 to $2.5 million per week until the taxes come in, which is, we get the tax turnover from Lane County typically right around the last week of the month. So there's still another 3-ish months, 2 to 3 weeks that we have to pay for, vendors and employees. So really, that minimum cash balance line should probably go down by another $5 to $10 million, depending on timing of when we get those receipts in.
But is this, I'm trying to also think, is it, if you could track this every day, and you put that minimum cash balance line there, the bar isn't going to be above that line every day. What you really want to do is make sure that that bar hits the line every day so you can pay your daily expenses,
That's exactly
right?
what I was getting at.
So this is really a cumulative amount of money that comes in, doesn't represent, oh, well, we're way above our cash balance, because the reality is if you spent a whole bunch of that, it just doesn't show on the graph that way, which is, the graph doesn't do it by day by day.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. You don't want this to graph to lull you into thinking that there's a lot of freeboard from UEFB that allows us to do something, which raises the second point, which is, there's the long term, and then there's something you might do temporarily. You might temporarily waive your reserve levels in anticipation that something's going to happen in a couple of years that will make you whole again. I would never support tapping reserves just on an ongoing basis. Nobody logically would. But an argument's been proposed that, well, you could make an exception for a couple of years until the new thing happens. My new job in January, so I'll keep paying my rent out of my savings account because I know I'm going to have a new job in January. Is that new job an increase in economic base, the tax base, which is one idea, or a new revenue source? At this point, we're having to guess with a crystal ball that's pretty cloudy as to will either one of those occur in the next couple of years that would justify us playing around with our reserve levels even temporarily.
And you've done that, right?
And we have done it in the past.
So if you think about the two pots of reserves, the UEFB, we budget that, and we need it to pay for our cash flow. The reserve for revenue shortfall is that place where we bridge a gap, which is what you're talking about. So we're bridging a gap in FY14. You can see from 13 to 14 that reserve for revenue shortfall went down. So we did indeed draw down that reserve while we have this conversation.
And to keep thinking about that, because it is, you know, I get really confused, and I've been doing this for more than a couple of years. But you have sort of the, you can even think about, we have UEFB of 2 months, but we have this 4-month gap between July and November. And so those don't match, and so what you're really doing, I think, is you're spending this to cover these costs until the property tax comes in. Well, that's not going to cover the whole 4 months. So part of that graph showed that some of that reserve for revenue shortfall is using for that. We're also getting some other revenues in, but not as much. So all of that allows you to hit that 4 months, so when your tax comes in, and so you've already spent your reserve for, or your UEFB, really to cover that. You're replenishing, and now you have your property tax coming in to pay all your costs, and by the time you get to the end, you've also kind of gotten back to where hopefully you've budgeted your reserve for revenue shortfall and others, so now you have that cash to use next year to do the same thing. And so if you don't have that 2 months there, you don't have enough to draw down in order to pay your bills until it gets cut up. Does that make sense? I mean, sort of. So it's a cash flow issue that all this is trying to address, and it just costs less because you're not borrowing for the cash flow. You actually have the cash to pay, and by the time you get to the end, June 30th, you've replenished that. Unless you've had some real problems with your revenue, you've replenished that, so now it's available for next year to use.
And the other thing I'd add on to that is, while we do draw it down during the year, while it's there, we are earning interest on it. So not a big revenue source right at the moment because interest rates are low, but it has been a very significant source of revenue for the general fund over the years. And so if you get rid of it, you also exacerbate your budget shortfall in another way. So,
Thank you. Anything else that would be helpful there?
Or not.
Or not?
Sorry.
No, you're great. Thank you. So we have 2 more people in the queue. However, we also must talk about our next steps before the end of the evening, which is in 10 minutes. So I'm going to request that there may be other questions that remain around the table, that if you have additional questions about this revenue presentation, that you email them to Sue. And Sue, if you could collect those and share them with the entire group after you've had a chance to answer them, that would be great, because I think we need to make sure that we have a chance to also talk about what our next steps are going to be. So I'm sorry for those of you who were in the queue at this point. So we're approaching our final meetings before council break. During our budget discussions last spring, we talked about embarking on this process with the charge to formulate a long-term sustainable budget strategy for the city. Our goal was to identify potential budget strategies to balance the FY15 budget and then send those strategy options to public hearings in January. So by our meeting on November 25th, we will have covered most of the items that we identified in our day-long workshop in July as necessary to us to complete the process, which includes the commission of the financial investigative team and their results and the report that we received at the last meeting, the list of potential service reductions and the second tier that we looked at last time around, and the matrix of how those were developed, the summary of the community engagement meetings that we debriefed this evening and that was shared in your packet, some additional media outreach, and thank you to Ken for covering with me and doing a great job with some media interviews for the FIT team that came up last week, and then the policy discussions that we had identified in July that were specific areas that we wanted to learn more about: reserves, asset maintenance, I can't remember what the other ones were, but we have basically covered all of those during our budget committee sessions. So as requested at our last budget committee meeting, if you have questions, comments, need additional clarification around items in the FIT report, or if you need other information to help the budget committee complete our work by December 9th, please let me know by the end of this week. So if I don't hear from you by the end of this week, I'm assuming you're great. You have everything you need, and you are ready to embark on discussion. So if you have other things, obviously execs and staff are also available to answer any offline questions, but if you have pieces of information that you are missing, that are really important for our conversation going forward, especially for FY15 in particular, please let me know so that our process team can put those in the mix for how we move forward. So after tonight, there are only 2 more meetings that we're scheduled to have. So the next meeting on November 25th will include the presentation and discussion of the general fund 6-year financial forecast and the start of our discussion about what our strategies are going to be for FY15. And that meeting's been extended to 2.5 hours. And that leaves us with 1 remaining meeting, which is December 9th, to finalize our recommendation. I'm a little concerned that that doesn't leave us enough time for discussion and decision-making, especially because I believe that there's also a council meeting on the 9th, which means that that is not a meeting that has a lot of opportunity to extend. And so I'm going to propose, and I'd like to open it up for other thoughts, but that we add an additional meeting the week of December 2nd when there is no council meeting scheduled that week. So the question for the group, and this can be a casual question where we just converse, or it can be a motion-based question, depending on how you want it to go, but of whether we would like to add another meeting into the mix, how people are feeling about how close you are to being ready to see the forecast on the 25th, have the 2.5-hour meeting that day to discuss, and December 9th be ready to get to the point at the end of that meeting of having recommendations that we would be ready to put forward for public hearings in January. Councilor Brown?
What kind of recommendations? I mean, we're going to have more meetings next spring, right, before we...
Yes, but my understanding is that this is where we will be saying, we'll hear the forecast. The forecast will say the gap is X. And we will be saying by December 9th, our recommendation for how we deal with that gap is thus. Public, what do you think?
Right. And then I think what you talked about is sending some of those things out to a public hearings in January.
Exactly, right.
On staff, and then ultimately I will have to present a budget to the budget committee, and presumably it will include a lot of the strategies and recommendations that this group comes up with over the next month or so as we kind of move forward to close the gap. And so...
but when you say month or so, you really mean the 2 meetings?
Right.
Okay,
But,
just
so...
month or so sounds like lots of extensive time.
Oh, okay. So,
Okay,
yeah, over
great.
the next couple of meetings, yes.
Right, okay.
Over the next couple of meetings,
Yes,
yes.
okay, thank you.
Over the next couple of meetings, which then I will take that as part of to incorporate into a budget that we will put together, then that does get presented back out to the budget committee, which then goes through a budget committee process at that point.
I saw you again, Councilor Brown. Will, did you have a question?
Excuse the freshman question here. Is there a staff member or is an executive team of the budget committee going to come up with a package that we are then going to discuss, or are we hoping to come up in this group with the we have a whole lot of options.
Yes.
We have like multiple restaurants full of multiple menus to choose from here for what to have for dinner, and how do we get from here to there?
Right.
I guess that is a process question.
Yes, so it's a good process question. So one of the big things before us is that the FIT report is great work. It's big, right? And there's dozens of items in there that we can consider, and I think we should read that carefully and have the opportunity to consider that. There are other things that people will want to look at and consider. So what we need to do over these next 2 meetings is actually to decide these are the things we want to put forward to the public as what we are recommending as ways to potentially solve whatever budget gap exists.
It's up to us.
Yes.
So we're going to do that as a full body.
That is generally how we do it. Yeah. Okay, I saw you. Thank you. Councilor Brown.
Yeah, I don't see how we can do that in essentially, basically 1 meeting or 1.5 meetings.
So does that mean that
thoroughly and coherently and...
So are you in favor of the idea of adding a meeting?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Not super thrilled about, like probably most of us, including staff, we're adding more meetings, but
No.
frankly, I just don't see how we can have, complete discussions about recommendations in that short a time frame, and I'm sorry, when will you prepare your proposed, I'm wondering, could we do it, add another meeting later, like after January 1st, or will that mess up the
think that
recommendation
is the
process?
question.
Yeah, what happens from our perspective is, of course, staff's been working on the budget for months, but we will essentially, by the end of the calendar year, have a pretty good framework for what the budget will be from a staff perspective. And so we're starting to sort of come to closure on a whole lot of those pieces as we move into the end of the calendar year, because there's lots of work that has to happen from the time that decisions are made by the executive team to the time that the budget is actually in a way that can be presented to the budget committee. There's a research and information. So we're starting to really frame out that pretty tightly as we move towards the end of the calendar year.
So you would rather have whatever recommendations we may develop, you want it before the January 1st, or, like the last meeting of
Right, so
December, because we're not going to meet for the last 2 weeks.
Right, yes.
You would have it, you need it sooner rather than later.
Yes, and then as it goes out to the public hearing, then, there's opportunities to sort of take some of that and sort of filter some of that into the conversation. But
Councilor Zelenka?
So on the 25th, we have the general fund forecast, or and we have a 2.5-hour meeting. How much of that is deliberations time? Or is it mostly taken up by presentations?
The time for the forecast presentation and discussion should be about 30 minutes.
Okay, so there's quite
So 2 hours.
2 hours of deliberation time.
Of deliberation time, and then an hour and a half, basically, on the 9th. Okay. I still think we need an extra meeting. I don't see how we possibly could develop anything in that short amount of time. But it brings up a question about what is it that exactly we're doing, which is what, are you envisioning that there's a budget committee recommendation and a city manager recommendation, competing proposals that go out on a public hearing? Or what I'm missing is, how does what the budget committee develop feed into your recommendation, for which then goes out to public hearing in January? And how does it influence that? And so then what does the budget committee recommendation look like? For instance, George could come up with a proposal about how he thinks the budget should have been put together based on the things that he said during the campaign. And how would that flow through this whole conversation?
What I would anticipate, or could anticipate, is if the budget gap is $100, and we say, okay, we have to figure out how to close the $100 gap, then the budget committee would come up with a strategy to close that. And in my mind, that would be it could be a motion, but somehow it's a budget committee's, here's our recommended strategy for closing the gap. Now, by charter, I could ignore that or not. I obviously won't ignore that, because there's a lot of work going into that. And so I think what would come back to you as a proposed budget would look a whole lot like that kind of a strategy. And so I think that's partly what would show up then. That you won't actually receive until I make the budget presentation. Generally, that occurs in April. So what could happen is this group now makes a recommendation on how to close that $100 gap. We'll take that and do our pieces to that. And there's a lot of other parts to the budget, as we know, other funds and all. You could send something out to a public hearing, depending on how those conversations work. I submit a budget based on those initial conversations and subsequent conversations. You may tweak it a little bit, like you. It's not uncommon and very purposeful with the budget committee. Or you may not, or maybe the timing just happens to coincide where any of that public input on that first series of public hearings influences what I actually submit. So I could see it either way that way.
When are we having the public hearings? I thought that was in January.
Right, that's what we've talked about. That's
That
for
wouldn't
this
be your
process.
recommendation. It
Right.
would be from
That's for
whatever
this process. There's other public hearings that come as a result of I submit my budget. The Budget Committee still has some legal obligations to evaluate that, to include public hearings, and then actually pass the final budget.
So on the 25th, we get the forecast is a little better, say $500,000 better, and then we have the gift that we got from the legislature about the PERS. That's an extra $1.5 million. So all of a sudden, $5.2 million looks more like $3.2 million.
Or $6 million, depending on how other stuff came in, but whatever, yeah.
Right, but I'm not anticipating it's going to go up. I like my scenario a lot better, Mr. City Manager. And when you create the scenario, please take that in mind. So that means that, so we're in the $3.5 million gap then. So what we would do is come up with a plan to fill that gap.
That would be our
Either
best
revenues or cuts.
Right, that's our best outcome. If this group isn't able to land on something, I still have a legal responsibility to present a balanced budget, and so we will do that.
And will we know on the 25th what that gap is?
On the 25th, what we will do is provide you the gap based on all the information that we know to date.
Right, which could change over the next several months before we get to...
Yes, it could. So it's that snapshot, but it's our best estimate, and I don't know what that is. We're still gathering some information. So whatever that number is our best information. That's the gap target that we would suggest that we work towards.
So I guess the other logical question is, how do you proceed with that process that we had? I don't particularly like the process that we did last year, which was whoever threw out the first idea gets, we talk about that first. I think that's an illogical way to proceed. It just happened to be who thought of something first process, which doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't know what that process looks like, but I didn't like that one.
You mean how the motions get processed?
Yeah.
Okay. Think about that. I'm open to other suggestions, other than first come, first serve. Okay. So we are actually, so I know there's other people who want to comment. I just want to make sure that we're over time already, that we make a decision about whether we want to add another meeting to our calendar.
Straw poll.
Okay, straw poll. All those in favor?
The week of the second.
The week of the 2nd.
Always cancel it if
We can always cancel if we need to. Okay. All right, so I would say that's, okay, thank you. So that's a yes, so I will ask the staff to coordinate when we can look for a time there. So I'm sorry that I know these meetings are frustrating when we're right up against a council meeting and people have things they want to say and we can't hear everything, and my apologies for that. I like the longer meetings myself, but here's where we are. So.
Week of the 2nd, we can make it a really long meeting.
Yeah, so the final thing I will say is, to your comment, Councilor Zelenka and others, we do have a process team meeting, so that's the mayor and the city manager and Councilor Polling and I, prior to our meeting on the 25th, and so that's exactly the kind of thing we'll consider is what's the best way for us to proceed through that process. And so the final thing is, please do email me by this Friday, especially about what are your most critical, what are the open items for you or the areas where you need continued discussion or information specific to helping you make a decision. So think about that, and anything that is missing for you, please let me know. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.
No.